Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 8th of April, where we are talking about Richard II. And I am working my way through your papers. And as you know, you all have the option of revising your first paper. So when I return your paper to you with a letter grade and my comments, if you wanted to revise, you can incorporate my comments into a revision. If you needed further direction, you could reach out to me. And I just ask that you submit in the revision along with the original graded copy with my comments so I can compare and contrast the two. And you would get the higher of the two grades, which should be the revision grade. And in terms of due dates, you would have up until the ending of the semester to do that. But the earlier the better for everybody involved. And what you would be doing with your second paper, which is due at the ending of the semester, is very similar to what you did with your first paper, a critical paper in which I'm asking you to respond to the quote that's on our syllabus about not expecting easy answers from Shakespeare. That said, you can always create your own essay topic. Just make sure you have that topic approved by me. Paper length approximately 4 to 5 pages, double spaced 1-inch margins without consulting outside resources. And no, you wouldn't have probably time to revise that second paper because it's due at the ending of the semester. But the idea is that the first paper was the learning exercise of how to construct a paper. So the second paper is just duplicating what you did with the first paper, the distinction being that you would be writing about different plays. And my assumption would be that you would either be writing about a history play, which is Richard II, or you might be writing about the upcoming tragedies. And that's how we end this semester. We begin with Macbeth, and then we end with Othello, which is very similar to Midsummer Night's Dream, by the way. Or I'm sorry, which is very similar to Much Ado About Nothing, by the way, but with a negative ending. And then we will also briefly discuss the tragic comedies, and that happens to be Shakespeare's play The Tempest that I assigned as an extra credit play. And for your final examination, what I will do is I will put a question in which you could earn extra credit points. That said, you don't have to read The Tempest, but if you are interested in earning a bit of extra credit, you could tackle the essay question. Your final exam will just be a series of essay questions that I'll ask you to choose from, and it will be open book, open note. So you aren't required to memorize anything. If you were taking the final exam in a face-to-face class, you would have approximately 2 hours. Since this is an online class, you will have 24 hours to do that. And I'll talk more about the final as we get a little bit closer. But as you know, we've spent a good amount of time watching the BBC production of Richard II. The history plays are notoriously complex, and Richard II is not the easiest of reads. So I think it was very useful, especially because the BBC version that we saw is pretty much an exact version of what Shakespeare wrote. So this is the closest you're going to get to a production that would mimic the text. Before I begin talking about Richard II, I'm sure you're aware that we are in the registration period now. I encourage you to reach out to your advisor or the advising center if you haven't already done so. And that said, the advantage to registering early is you get exactly what you want, when you want it, with who you want as your teacher. And I suspect that you've probably satisfied your requirements for a 200 level English class, which is what this class is. But if it turns out that you have not, or if it turns out that you would like to take an additional 200 level English class, I can let you know that I'm teaching a Women in Literature class during the first summer session. It's online. It's constructed much like this one is. It's a Women in Literature 1 class, so it's from authors from the 1800s. And Also, I am teaching in the fall semester rather than Shakespeare, my Gothic literature class. As you know, I'm a fan of the Gothic, and we read texts such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In fact, if you really like 200 level English classes, if you were to take 6 of them over the course of your academic career, you could graduate with the liberal arts degree with a concentration in English. And since most students have to take one 200 level English class, that would mean that basically you would take 5 additional classes. It's very similar to the liberal arts degree, the distinction being that most of the electives are devoted to English classes. And that is very handy because if you were to change your mind along the way, you could easily just change into your general liberal arts degree and use the English classes that you've already taken as electives. That was done deliberately by design so you could move back and forth between those 2 degrees if you so wanted to. And while I'm mostly known for teaching English classes, you will see that I have included in the notes below 2 classes that at this point I think haven't listed my name yet as instructor, but I should be the instructor for CMN 201, which is horror film and medium popular culture. Again, a very nice compliment to Gothic literature. And PCS 141, which is interpersonal communications. And there's more information about that at the bottom of our notes. And certainly if you have any questions, let me know. And you can see in our notes in the first section, I've included the actual history of what happened during Richard II's reign. As you know, the history plays are loosely based on British history. There was a history book at the time known as the Chronicles of Holinshed that reviewed the major elements of history of that time. And this is the story of a medieval king. In 1312 to 1377, King Edward III was in reign, and he was the father of several sons, including Lionel, who's known as the Duke of Clarence, Edward, who's known as the Black Prince, and John of Gaunt, who's known as the Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, known as the Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester. You probably recognize some of these names because some of these names are actually part of the play Richard II. And in terms of Richard II, Richard's father, Edward the Black Prince, died. This would be the eldest son, and Edward died when Richard was a boy. Richard became a boy king at that point, and basically his uncles, which would be the sons of Edward III, helped to rule the kingdom until Richard was of age. John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, happens to be the father of Henry Bolingbroke, also known as the Duke of Hereford. We had talked about that one of the reasons why the history plays are complicated is because one character will go by multiple names. They might go by a first name, they might go by a surname, they might go by their position. So keeping a chart of the characters can be very useful. And Edmund of Langley, also known as the Duke of York, and these are 2 major characters in Richard II, John of Gaunt and the Duke of York. But Edmund Langley, the Duke of York, is the father of Aumerle, the Earl of Rutland, who will be important as the play progresses. And the actual history, Shakespeare took some dramatic liberties with, as I told you, but we're not focusing on the actual history. We are focusing on Shakespeare and his drama. And I had left you with multiple questions to consider as we were watching the BBC version, and that's in the second section of the notes below. That why does Bolingbroke, for instance, accuse Mowbray of Gloucester's murder? And one of the challenges of the history plays is that we will never know for certain what is happening. What we get is the world of politics, and the world of politics is filled with intrigue and mystery. So we have to, and oftentimes, guess as to motivations. And it could be that Bolingbroke accuses Mowbray of this murder because Mowbray's guilty and Bolingbroke wants to do the right thing. It could be because Bolingbroke is hopeful that he can perhaps worm his way into Richard II's kingdom and achieve greater status and power. It could be both at the same time. And in some historical accounts, the accusation is the exact opposite, that it's Mowbray who accuses Bolingbroke, but Shakespeare made the very deliberate decision that it's going to be Bolingbroke accusing Mowbray of Gloucester's murder. Mowbray denies he's Gloucester's murderer. It could be that he's not Gloucester's murderer, or it could be that he is Gloucester's murderer, and of course he doesn't want to admit to it because that would be a treasonous crime. So Richard responds by wanting Bolingbroke and Mowbray to settle their dispute. And it could be because Richard wants peace in the kingdom. It could be because Richard is somehow involved in Gloucester's murder and does not want any more questions being asked. So why does Richard decide on a public battle? Now, it could be that Richard decides on a public battle because he is hopeful that the victor will be the honorable person that deserves to win. It could be that Richard wants a public battle because he hopes that they both kill each other in battle, and this problem, which may or may not be a problem for Richard, will go away. This suggests that perhaps Richard was involved in Gloucester's murder. It could be that Richard cancels this public battle because he wants to be seen as a just king with kindness and empathy. Or it could just be that Richard cancels this public battle because he is indecisive and he's a poor ruler. Or it could be a little bit of both. And then Richard gives out 2 punishments. And he punishes Mowbray for life and punishes Bolingbroke for 10 years and then reduces the sentence to 6. This is quite suspicious. One assumes that Mowbray is given a life punishment because somehow Mowbray knows something about Richard that Richard doesn't want exposed, especially when when Richard makes it very clear that Mowbray and Bolingbroke should not be consulting with one another upon exile. Now, giving Bolingbroke 10 years and then reducing it to 6, it could be that Richard is trying to portray himself as, again, a kind and empathetic ruler so that he's showing some leniency. It could be, however, that once again, Richard is a poor ruler and he's indecisive and he vacillates. And Gaunt, which was his historical name, this is Bolingbroke's father, but Gaunt is also a symbol of the Gaunt England, an England that has been poisoned by Richard's poor rule and that ultimately is dying. Gaunt, on his deathbed, warns Richard against the dangers of poor rule. If you're ever going to tell the truth, you do it on your deathbed. And then he dies. Now, if you remember the chain of being during this time period where everything has a position in society, and that would be God at the top, and then the angels in heaven, and then humans. And in the human world, the king would be at the very top. They would be considered God anointed, God's mouthpiece. So one would never question the king. And one of the central questions in this play is, but what happens if you have an ineffective king, or even worse, a corrupt king? Do you just accept it as God's will? Or do you question that king and try to usurp God's will? And there's no clear-cut answer. And this was a central question for the time period, Shakespeare's time, because of Queen Elizabeth. And that Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, who had never had children, was entering old age and would soon pass away. And there were no clear heirs in sight. And the question was, how did one determine rule if there were no heirs? Would it be the closest family relation, because blood right is what usually determines rule? But of course, no one had a direct blood right because she didn't have heirs. Or was it the person who had the greatest ability to rule, even though they might not necessarily have the closest blood right? And politics were very dangerous during this time period. It wasn't something that you discussed publicly. Sex and violence, certainly you could discuss in a play. Politics, you had to be much more careful. There would be a master of revels, in effect, a censor, evaluating everything and making sure that there wasn't any questionable political commentary in the plays. So what Shakespeare did was brilliant, is he talked about the political question of the day, but he said it in the medieval period, in the politics of the past. And he could easily say that this had absolutely nothing to do with contemporary times. It was merely a coincidence. But anybody who carefully reads and watches this plays will see that there are too many parallels for it to be just a coincidence. So, what happens after Bolingbroke dies is clearly an indication of how corrupt and unqualified Richard is. Richard seizes Bolingbroke's inheritance and decides to use the money to fund his Irish wars. And at this point, England is at war with Ireland, and Richard is participating, but for him, it's more of a video game, if we wanted to use a modern day parallel, than anything else. He is going to run off and participate in the Irish wars, but one assumes that he's as safe as one could be in the wars because he would be surrounded by soldiers and they would risk their lives to protect him. So this is a way for him to engage in some adventure. And Richard, at that point, leaves the kingdom so that he can, in effect, play or battle in the Irish Wars. And he entrusts the kingdom with York. This is not very smart because obviously eyebrows are going to be raised as to Richard stealing Bolingbroke's inheritance and also Richard going off and using that money for the Irish Wars rather than for the benefit of the English populace itself. So this sets the stage for a coup, which is exactly what happens as the play progresses. So why are these things happening? Richard is either clueless or Richard is just so arrogant that he thinks that he's ultimately unbeatable and can never be removed from power. And of course, we see the exact opposite as the play progresses. Bolingbroke at that point will break his exile and he will demand his inheritance. The thing is that he comes with his own army. So yes, we could say that Bolingbroke feels justified to get his own inheritance because it was stolen from him by Richard. But why would he need an entire army? So the question remains as to how innocent Bolingbroke is, and could Bolingbroke see this as an opportunity to return and seize the kingdom from Richard, which is exactly what happens. Now, York, a central player at this point, and remember that the kingdom was entrusted with York, and he's a loyal subject to Richard, as well he should be, at this point vows to remain neutral, or as he says, neuter. He knows that Richard has done unjust and corrupt things, but he's not willing to usurp the law of God, at least the way it would be viewed in the chain of being, with Richard being God anointed. And of course, when Bolingbroke confronts Richard, it's one of the best scenes in the play because we see Richard vacillate from arrogance and pride to a sorrow and despair so easily. Again, not a good way for a ruler to conduct himself, certainly publicly. And Richard relinquishes his throne to Bolingbroke, and you might say that this is a sign of weakness from Richard, just so easily giving up. But keep in mind at this point, Richard doesn't really have the troops that he needs to support his position, and certainly not to support a coup attempt by Bolingbroke. And if Bolingbroke is standing there with a full army, that's quite intimidating, and I think the message pretty much is either you relinquish or we will battle you and take it by force. It almost reminds me of when someone is forced to quit a job rather than be fired from the job, and they know that it's going to be one or the other. One of the best scenes in the play is that the gardeners discuss the state of affairs of what's going on in the kingdom while the queen overhears. Notice how This is very much a male-centric play because it's focusing on the idea of the male political world. The gardeners are lower levels on the chain of being. They're comparable to laborers, and yet they have an insight and understanding about the political machinery and machinations of the country that those in higher positions on the chain of being don't. And of course, the queen has been completely left out of these political issues. So the way that she learns that Richard has lost the kingdom is by eavesdropping and listening to the gardeners who make parallels between gardening and having a kingdom and raising it and caring it and the need to prune out weeds, so forth. Um, and you can see that in the notes below, I've indicated the Richard versus Bolingbroke, and that's in the third section. While there are many characters in this play, it really comes down to those two forces. There definitely is suspicion about Richard's possible guilt in Gloucester's murder. Perhaps he was working with Mowbray in that instance. And there are also, however, suspicions about Bolingbroke. Are his actions completely innocent? But we do know that Richard makes mistakes, quite a few of them. Gaunt basically warns Richard against poor rule, and Richard ignores that and instead steals Bolingbroke's inheritance. Not smart. Then Richard leaves for the Irish Wars and entrusts York with the kingdom. Also not smart, because eventually York sees that there's been so much corruption that he can no longer remain neuter or neutral, and that he has to take a position, and he decides ultimately to support Bolingbroke. This is huge because he's going against the idea of the chain of being. However, York's own son, Aumerle, still supports Richard. So we see how ultimately families are divided over politics. And I've oftentimes told students, I've taught this play many years, to substitute, if they're having difficulty reading the play, to substitute some contemporary political names for the characters, and it'll probably make a lot more sense that the machinations in Washington or in any other political structure would parallel much of what we see happening in Richard II. And certainly we're in a time period where politics are particularly toxic, where families literally are coming apart over their political alliances, which is something that what we see in Richard II. The consequences of all of this is that Richard breaks his exile with an army. He says to get his inheritance, but he ultimately gets the kingdom. Richard, after multiple tantrums, and we'll talk about some of those tantrums later, Richard really is a little boy in many ways, relinquishes his throne to Bolingbroke, but of course we might say that what other option would he have? And we see the factions form, some of the factions for Richard, such as Aumerle, and some of the factions for Bolingbroke, such as York. Bolingbroke at this point becomes the king, and that means he's no longer Bolingbroke, but he's going to be referred to as Henry IV. And in fact, the history plays, while they can each be read as independent units, they ultimately, as a whole, tell a longer story of English history. So we're stopping after the first play in the chronology of the history plays, Richard II. However, there is a second play called Henry IV, which happens to be the story of Bolingbroke's rule, now that he's Henry IV. And in fact, it's such a long story that it occurs over two plays, Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2. And then ultimately we have a Henry V, which is the story of his son. So you can see how the succession occurs. So Bolingbroke, King Henry, now decides to imprison Richard and execute traitors, and in many ways is starting to act as arrogant and as filled with hubris or excessive pride as Richard did. And in fact, it seems that they almost switch roles in some respects. Now, Aumerle actually plans a treason against the current political structure. And This is York's son again, and we see how York ultimately is ready to sacrifice O'Mell for treason. O'Mell's mother begs for O'Mell's forgiveness from Henry IV, which Henry IV granted. And again, we can ask some questions. Why would Henry IV grant a pardon? Is it because these are his family relations and he feels some empathy? Is it because he wants to be owed a favor because he knows that ultimately he will come and ask for it to be fulfilled? Or is it some sort of combination of the two? And we see how, again, husband and wife are completely torn over the idea of political alliance. And we see how Richard is not just removed from his position, he's humiliated and imprisoned. And one of the things Bolingbroke does is that he tries to decrease the amount of humiliation that Richard experiences publicly. Perhaps that shows that Bolingbroke is a better ruler, because he has some perhaps sympathy or empathy for Richard. After all, they are related. Or maybe he's just a smarter ruler. Bolingbroke, now as Henry IV is, realizing that by publicly humiliating Richard, they're going to turn him into a martyr. Because this is a very tricky place in the kingdom where about half of the kingdom supports Richard and half of the kingdom supports Bolingbroke as the new king, as Henry IV. One of the things you should have noticed when you were reading this play is that Richard talks. He doesn't act. He talks and talks and talks. There are these long, long speeches within the play. And in fact, Richard is really a poet, not a ruler. So in many ways, he seems to be misplaced as to where he is. He doesn't act until the very ending of the play, where he tries to protect himself against an assassination, where Exton assassinates Richard in prison. But it's too little, too late. And the idea behind Exton taking action, at least according to Exton, is that he had overheard Bolingbroke, who's now Henry IV, saying how nice it would be if Richard were executed. And Bolingbroke says that he certainly never meant to suggest that he wanted Richard executed. And again, in terms of the questions of why, it could have just been Bolingbroke making an innocent statement, not realizing that somebody would actually take action. Or it could be very calculated that Bolingbroke, again as Henry IV, realized that if he wished out loud that Richard were executed, then ultimately somebody would probably take action and take care of the problem for him, because Henry, previously Bolingbroke, can't execute Richard, because if he does, then he's executing the God anointed, and that would make more of the populace angry. So we don't know, much like when we are watching politics in our own time, we don't necessarily know what the motivations are for the actions that the politicians take, and we certainly don't know the reasoning that goes on in politicians' heads. All we know is what they say to the public, which may or may not be true. So Bolingbroke, upon learning that Richard has been killed, he acts upset. Perhaps he truly is upset, or perhaps he's merely play acting. And he decides to take a pilgrimage to the Holy Land because he realizes that there is some element of sin that he could be blamed for. And he knows it's going to be an uneasy rule, which is what we see with Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2. This play has lots of beautiful language within it. So next class, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the quotes in the play that are so significant. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about something called the tragic hero, which you may or may not be familiar with. This goes all the way back to Greek drama, Oedipus the King, actually. And Oedipus the King established this idea of tragedy and tragic hero. And while the play Richard II is technically a history play, not a tragedy, note the title of the play. It's The Tragedy of Richard II. So it has many elements associated with tragedy, even though the actual tragedies themselves don't occur until we start reading plays like Macbeth or Othello. And what makes this play, Richard II, a history play is because it's based on British history. There was indeed a British king that was named Richard II. And there was indeed a British king that succeeded after that, that was Henry IV. In terms of the tragic hero, Oedipus the king laid out the criteria of what we could expect of a tragic hero. That this would be a great man who would be above and beyond the ordinary, somebody that we admire and respect, somebody who is above us. And this is important because if they fall or commit errors, then we too can fall and commit errors because we aren't nearly as great as they are. So this is somebody above and beyond the ordinary who does experience his downfall. And the downfall is the result of two elements: outside forces, things beyond your control, oftentimes referenced as fate, but in contemporary times it could be something called luck. And also tragic flaws, errors within that person's character that leads to their downfall. And then this person accepts responsibility for their flaw or flaws that helped to bring this about, but it wasn't completely their fault because there are outside forces at play, which makes us feel pity for the character because it wasn't completely their fault, and also fear because of the characters above and beyond us and can experience such a terrible fate. Then we ourselves could experience something that's equally terrible, if not more so. If you aren't familiar with the play Oedipus the King, which is usually used as the example of tragedy, it happens to be the Greek story of a king, Oedipus, who is in the midst of ruling his kingdom, and the kingdom is suffering from plague. And he sends out all kinds of messengers and even his own family members, such as his brother-in-law, to the oracles to try to determine how they've offended the gods. Remember, this is 430 BC, so this is Greek society, so that they can appease the gods and eliminate the plague. And the same answer comes back, that it turns out that Oedipus, the king himself, is responsible for the plague. Oedipus won't believe it. He's filled with anger and denial and paranoia. And ultimately, as the backstory is revealed in the play, it turns out that Oedipus is indeed responsible. How did all of this come about? What we find out is that it started with Oedipus's birth parents. When Oedipus was born as a baby, the birth parents were given a prophecy by the oracle. Again, this is a time of oracles, that their son would grow up to marry his mother, kill his father. The parents are so horrified that they give the child to a servant to be killed. The servant feels pity on the child, abandons the child. It turns out that the child doesn't die, but the child is found by the servant of another kingdom and raised in another kingdom by the king and queen as their own son, their own biological son. And they never tell Oedipus that he is, in effect, adopted. And Oedipus grows up to be a man and consults the oracle, as people were wont to do during that time period. And Oedipus is told that he will soon kill his father and marry his mother. And Oedipus, as a man, is horrified and wants to prevent this from happening. After all, he's a good man. So what he ends up doing is deciding to leave his birth parents, or the people he thinks are his birth parents, and to be as far away from the kingdom as possible to protect them. But of course, the people he's leaving are not his birth parents, they're his adopted parents. And after he leaves, that only brings him closer and closer to his birth parents. So that, yes, it does turn out that he ends up killing his father. It's a tale in which, in a fit of anger, Oedipus ends up slaying everybody who's blocking his way on a crossroads, and one of those people happened to be his biological father. Or, as a student of mine once so aptly put a few years ago, this might be the first literary example of road rage. And then in the progression of what occurs, Oedipus comes to a kingdom that's ravaged by plague because of a monster, a sphinx. And the only way to defeat the monster is by solving the riddle. And no one is smart enough to solve the riddle, but Oedipus is smart enough to solve the riddle because Oedipus is above and beyond the ordinary in terms of his intelligence. And because Oedipus solves this riddle of the monster, he is given the kingdom in reward because their king was recently killed. And that means that Oedipus also gets the hand of the recently widowed queen, who, guess what, happens to be Oedipus's biological mother. And they marry, not knowing that they're related to one another, and have children. And that is what angers the gods on some level, the ancestral relationship. But what angers the gods even more is that Oedipus, and even prior to Oedipus, his birth parents, try to usurp the gods' will by trying to change their destiny or their fate. And the irony in the play is filled with irony, is that in trying to change their fate, they actually bring it about, leading to the question if they had never tried to change their fates, would have even happened. Which leads to all kinds of philosophical questions too, about things like destiny and predetermination and free will. So that's the play Oedipus the King. It's a very famous play, in part because it helps to establish the idea of that tragic hero, a man who is above and beyond the ordinary, somebody that we can have great respect for, someone who is much better than we are. So as much as they fell, we could fall much further. And they do experience a fall, in part because of their flaws or errors. That's the instructional element of the play. Don't duplicate their errors or flaws. But there are also outside forces, things that we can't control. Whether you want to call it fate or destiny or luck or whatever the case may be. And then ultimately, because this is a good person, they will accept some level of responsibility for what they've done. And Oedipus in the play Oedipus the King does accept responsibility. If you know the play Oedipus the King, he maims himself so that he can basically live in pain and suffering, rather than commit suicide, which is what his wife slash mother does, and which would not be considered to be taking responsibility. I encourage you to read Oedipus the King if you never have. But I mention Oedipus the King because it's related to the idea of the tragic hero that authors used afterwards and oftentimes would change or adapt for their own purposes. And when we get to Shakespeare, Shakespeare is probably best known for his tragedies, the Hamlets, the Othellos, the Macbeths. But even something like Richard II, which is a history play, again, I go back to the title, it is the tragedy of Richard II. So it has lots of tragic elements in it. So I spent all this time talking about tragic hero because I wanted us to examine whether or not Richard could be considered a tragic hero, somebody who is a great man, perhaps because he's king, who experiences downfall. And certainly Richard experiences downfall. He loses his kingdom and then eventually he's assassinated because of outside forces. And could something like Mowbray or Bolingbroke be seen as an outside force? And also because of tragic flaws, certainly Richard makes many mistakes. Accepting responsibility, that one's a little bit trickier. We know that when Richard is in prison, he's beginning to contemplate some of his errors. And one of my favorite lines is there, I've wasted time and now time doth waste me. But whether or not Richard truly accepts responsibility, I guess that's debatable. And this is typical of Shakespeare, of using the idea of a tragic hero and tweaking it to his own purposes. We'll see this even more clearly when we get into the tragedies proper, when we get into Macbeth, which happens to be Shakespeare's shortest play, and I think we'll all appreciate that after going through Richard II. And then ending with Othello, which is in many ways similar to Much Ado About Nothing. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about the tragic comedy, Shakespeare's last play that is considered, or at least what is considered to be Shakespeare's last play, The Tempest, which is your extra credit. So what I wanted to do for the attendance question is ask you, and this is for Wednesday the 10th, and I'm also behind on the discussion forum responses, so I hope to be able to catch up with all of this in the next week or so. Did you think Richard II could be considered a tragic hero, and why or why not? Do you think Richard II can be considered a tragic hero based on the definition I've given you of tragic hero, and why or why not? And then next class, we'll talk a little bit about some of Richard's quotes, and then we will move forward to our next play, which happens to be Macbeth. So my hope is that you have finished reading Richard II and that you are beginning with Macbeth, again, Shakespeare's shortest play. And of course, we'll also talk about production as well. So that's it. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye bye.